would like to start by saying that the approach that we are taking, or the research we've been carrying out on feedback in the Adam Smith Business School and other places across the world, it follows a quite different trajectory from other research nationally and internationally. And I say that because it starts from a different set of premises, one of which is that students are generating feedback all the time, even when they don't get comments from teachers, and it leads to a different set of practices. So let me explain. When we talk about feedback, we tend to think of the comments that someone provides on our work, on the student's work, that helps them to make improvements. Feedback is a communicative process. It's a dialogical exchange of some kind. However, from a learner perspective, they generate the feedback. When they receive comments from a teacher or someone else, they need to turn them into inner feedback in order to have an effect, or turn them into an inner feedback process if it's going to have an effect on performance. So since this idea of inner feedback is not commonplace or is easily misunderstood, I'll start with a definition. So my definition is that inner feedback is the new knowledge that students generate when they compare their current knowledge against some reference information guided by their goals. And I say guided by their goals because the students are the protagonists of feedback. If they don't do anything with it, or they're not interested in it, then it's not going to have any effect. There are three concepts that are really important in this. One is that all feedback is inner feedback. It's an inner generative process, albeit using external information and internal information. Secondly, that all feedback, and this is really not clear in the literature, is underpinned by a comparison process. Any kind of feedback involves a comparison. And thirdly, what students get from the comparison depends on where they start from, their current knowledge, which is usually represented in some task, and what they compare that knowledge against, the reference information. And normally that reference information is teacher comments. It's a relational thing, it's a dialogue. This is the way that we think about it. This is the dominant idea in the international literature and in everyday life. So this diagram shows the feedback process, in terms of comments. The students do some work, they write an essay, they produce a report, they solve a problem. Someone gives them some comments on their work. They compare the comments against their work, and they generate feedback out of that, and that's what leads to performance improvements. However, students are generating feedback all the time, even when there's no comments or dialogue from anyone else. The feedback process it's a natural, ongoing process that permeates all learning, and it's the means by which students regulate their own learning. For example, imagine a student producing a homework assignment and they get stuck. They don't really remember how to understand the concept, and they check out the textbook for some information to help them with that. They compare the information in the textbook against the information that they're trying to produce, and they generate feedback. They may go online and look at a video of experts talking about something, and they generate feedback from that. They may go and look at a diagram, and they generate feedback from that. They may look at their peers' work and generate feedback from that. They may discuss it with their peers and generate feedback. They may be in a lecture class, and the lecturer the next day is talking about something. They say, oh, that could help me with my report, and they generate feedback from that. So students are generating feedback all the time, independently of what the teacher is planning for. We're just not really paying attention to this. We're not capitalizing on this fully as we could. Obviously, some people have thought about peer comments as another type of comments. That gives a bit more agency to the students. But when you think of it as comments, it's just the same thing, the same mechanism, comparative mechanism at play. Now, this diagram, there's a lot of things you could say about this diagram. One of them is the only thing we're planning for, as I said, is teacher comments rather than these other things. teacher comments represent only a very small proportion of the information that students use to generate feedback. And another point about it is that students are generating feedback using these other resources during the act of production, not just at the end. Another thing is that what students use to generate feedback results in different kinds of feedback. So variability is important. Another thing is that it's important to realize that when I say they're using things from the right-hand side, it's the information in those things that they're using. But those things, those items or resources, can be in different formats. So it's not about, when I say comparison, people say, they immediately think peer review, they can compare their work against peers. And that is actually where I started from. But they can compare their work against things of different formats. And there's a lot of power in that. So you write an explanation of the digestive system and you compare it against a flowchart of the digestive system. It brings the timeline into view. You compare it against a diagram of the digestive system. It brings the interrelationships of components into view. And this is how you can use resources to generate critical thinking, to target critical thinking. But what you need is proper comparators, and then a key element is the right kinds of instructions, at least initially. What the hope is, and we'll see that this is a realistic possibility, that after you train students in this way of working, they'll be able to generate feedback themselves. Oh, I'm in 7 minutes in. Okay, finally on this slide, if it's that simple, why has no one done this before? That's a big question. And the reason is, I think, a primary reason is that no one has identified comparison before as the underpinning of all feedback processes. It has actually been identified as the underpinning of other cognitive processes, memory, problem solving, reasoning. You could say even learning, to connect new information to what you already know. Do you not need to compare it and find the connections and then build new knowledge out of that? So it's embedded in the whole learning process. So in a way, it's kind of invisible because of that. The first comparison we make, I like to say, is between mother and other. It's there, but it's invisible, so we haven't really been making use of it. So all we've been doing in our business school and beyond is researching what feedback students can generate when we give them information sources other than comments, resources of different kinds. And what we've found is that students can generate a lot of the feedback themselves without teachers. At the very least, it would complement the feedback the teachers give as comments, but under certain circumstances, it can surpass completely things that the teacher could provide. It can surpass the teacher's feedback, but also even within that scope, they'll always generate feedback that's directly related to their needs, whereas getting comments is a kind of controlling device in some ways in terms of feedback. So that's what we've been doing. So how do we turn this into reality? It's just, there's really only one principle involved in this. You get the students to do some work, to make some comparisons against something, different kinds of resources, and you give them instructions, and they have to make the output explicit in some way. And writing is very, very good, but it could be writing in a video or audio output, or in discussion with peers, or in actions to make improvements, or in graphical form. This is the most important principle of this. It requires not very much, just getting the students to actually make an explicit output. And that turns active learning into active feedback. Simple as that. And whenever you do active learning, to turn it into active feedback, just give them something to compare against. Why is explicitness important? Just because something is natural doesn't mean it's powerful. Explicitness turns a natural process into a powerful pedagogical tool. From the student's perspective, explicitness gives them awareness of their own feedback capability. It's an empowering process. When they generate their own feedback, they also transfer it to new contexts. From the teacher's perspective, we're always making assumptions about what students know, writing comments. From a teacher's perspective, when they get the student's work and the feedback they've generated, then the teacher has better diagnostic information in order to stage another comparison or to provide feedback comments. So it benefits the teachers in many ways. This diagram is my conceptual summary of the whole thing. If we just put that third leg into play, then we change everything. We create a solid platform for learning and feedback. But importantly, it addresses two issues that have never been successfully addressed before. One is, how do we deal with the tension between the idea that we want students to be independent and self-regulated learners, but we're going to tell them all the time what to do? And the other one is, how do we increase feedback at scale without increasing our workload? This is the trajectory to achieve both of those aims. So this is my example of how you put this into practice, and then Suzanne's going to give some examples. So students do some work, and this is the normal thing. We like them to be active. Active learning is great, but we'll give them comments on the active learning. We'll get peers to give comments. So this is low student feedback agency, high teacher workload. All we need to do to build this situation is to get students to make some resource comparisons before they get feedback from the teacher. The students do the heavy feedback workload, and then the teacher sees what feedback they really need. And there can be cycles of this, so we go round this in cycles, making the output explicit in some way. Of course, we don't want to, I'm not saying in this talk, don't get me wrong, in this talk I'm not saying that comments and dialogue are not important. Each type of feedback, comments, dialogue, resources, ChatGPT, has different strengths and weaknesses, and what we need to do is to balance across them. So dialogue is important in all of this. I started with peer review, and I'm an advocate of peer review. But I show this diagram because we don't really use resource comparisons properly in all of this. So we bring peer review in, the students do something, they make some comparisons, then they get into their peers, and they discuss what they've produced, the feedback they've generated, so they elaborate their own feedback. And then the output of that might be a question for the teachers, or something you don't understand now. After all of that stuff you've done, formulate a good question for the teacher. And then the teacher just gives the targeted feedback that's needed. So a teacher can give better feedback like this. Of course, it doesn't need to be that sequence. I was showing that as the idealized sequence. We might start, get students to do some work, compare it with their peers, have a discussion. And then as they're doing that, we say, take this resource, use this as part of your discussion. Three-way comparisons, and build your work from there. So we can do this anytime. In a school classroom, it's very simple. You've got groups of kids doing things in different tables, and you walk around, say where they are, and they say, oh yeah, compare yours against this one. Oh yeah, you're ready for this one. Very, very easy to do in that kind of classroom. Slightly more difficult in higher education. So this is high student feedback agency, low teacher feedback workload, because teacher feedback is always end-loaded. It's always the last thing that the students get. Okay, now I'm going to now pass you to Suzanne. I should say, Suzanne's going to do one talk. We're going to get much deeper on this, the critical thinking. Suzanne's going to do a talk, then we're going to have questions, and then we'll move to something really more deeper, and Suzanne will give another example. Thanks, Suzanne.
Okay, thank you, David. All right, so that's been quite a lot of information to take in so far. So what I'm going to try and help you do is see actually what does our role become as the educator, how do we fit in, and how do we make all of this work? So the starting point is you get your students to complete a task. Now that doesn't have to be anything different from what you already ask them to do. So you decide what the students are going to do, and then in order to turn this active learning into active feedback, what you then have to think about first is actually what do you want to achieve? Because what you'll see as the presentation unfolds is that different comparators can take you to different places. So you need to think about what you want to achieve, and that will then help you select what's the most important and most appropriate comparators for that situation. So once you've selected your comparators, you then have to give clear instructions, thinking about how you're going to make the output explicit to help the students move on, and then you plan for the next cycle. So this is how it works. Let's look at an example. And for this first example, it's a written task that I gave my students. So this is first-year students in our financial accounting course in their first few weeks of first year. So the task I gave them was I asked them to write a short 500-word essay, and then in terms of comparators, there were 4 things they were going to compare against. So first of all, 3 peer essays, 2 of which were randomly selected from their own peer cohort, and the middle one, and I was a wee bit sneaky because I didn't tell them in advance, the middle one was a high-quality example that I'd selected from a prior year. So they've got 3 essays that they're going to compare with, so that is in the same format. And then they're going to compare with 2 sets of peer comments, so comments against an essay that's in a different format. But what's important here is this is not a traditional peer review study, because what we've done is we've added an extra stage where we're focusing on the inner feedback process and making that explicit. So how we did that is by asking the students to complete a self-feedback commentary after each of the comparisons. So the students are doing all of this. I've removed myself from the process. That's why there's a picture of me with a cross through it. I'm not providing any comments. I've set all this up so the students can do it on their own without any comments from me. So to help explain a little bit more, because the instructions are important, here's a little more detail on how things worked. So the students start off writing their essay, and remember the important process, the bit we're focusing on, is this self-feedback commentary. So after writing their essay, they compare their essay with peer essay number 1. At that point, we gave them a series of questions that they had to write an answer to. So we asked them, what's the 2 main differences between this essay and yours, and to explain. We asked what they learned from those differences, and to rank the 2 essays. So after they've done this, they move on and they look at peer essay number 2, the high-quality one. They compare that with their own essay, and they answer the same questions. So you can also start to see why I didn't tell them that was a high-quality one when I'm asking them to rank. That might have influenced their decision. And then they go through the process again, but this time when they have self-review 3, comparing their essay against peer essay number 3, we ask them slightly different questions in the self-review. So we asked them what they learned. We asked them to rank all 4 essays, so the 3 peer essays and their own, to put them into order and to give an explanation for that. And we asked them to identify specific actions they could take to improve their work. And then for the final round, for self-review 4, this time they're comparing their work against 2 sets of peer comments. And we asked them this time, what did you learn from reading the reviews from your peers? And have you actually gained anything extra? Have you identified any additional improvements? So this is how we set things up. And I was a little concerned about what would happen, because it's an accounting course that the students are taking. They're very focused on the numbers. They don't like to write anything in the first place. So would they take this seriously, and would they write much in their self-reviews? Well, actually, I was amazed by the volume of information the students generated. They wrote a huge amount, but we all know that quality and quantity are not the same thing. So therefore, for the research study purposes, we took a sample of the students' work. I marked the essays in the way I normally would and produced feedback comments just for the research study, not to give to the students, so we could then compare the feedback comments I would have provided with what the students produced in their self-feedback reviews. And actually, what they could do was really amazing, because the students were able to match and exceed the comments I would have provided, and this was true at all ability levels, not just your top performing students. So what we have here in the top graphic is, so after self-review 1, where they've just compared their essay with peer essay number 1, 17% of the students could match or even exceed the feedback comments I would have provided. After going through this process twice, so self-review 2, so they've looked at peer essay 1 and peer essay 2, we're now at 46% of the students could match the comments I would produce. After self-review 3, so looking at all 3 peer essays and completing the 3 self-reviews, we're at 66%. And after self-review 4, where they've received and compared against peers' comments, we're at 90%. Now, for the small number of students who didn't fully match all the comments I would have provided, in my view, they'd identified all the major issues, and it was just a couple of minor points that were missing. But rather than just being able to match what I would have said, the students actually exceeded that, and in a range of different ways. So first of all, in relation to the criteria, they gave a lot more detail, because they weren't as time-bounded as I would be when looking at their own work. They often identified additional issues and gave really detailed action points on how they could improve their work. But they also went well beyond just the criteria, and they moved to other aspects where it'd be difficult, if not impossible, to achieve just using comments from me. So they talked about, for example, a motivational aspect. They talked about switching from standing in the writer's shoes to thinking about the reader and how that message is going to transmit and be received at the other end. They started to talk about the reader's perspective. They talked about seeing alternative approaches to the same kind of problem and how this was really valuable. So you could see the students starting to push beyond and move towards these higher level critical thinking skills that we're aiming for. So the students were able to achieve this. What did they think? Well, here's a student quote to give you an idea. So one of my students said, making comparisons forces you to engage and understand the material more than just getting told what to fix or amend. Because I'm sure you're often in the same position. You spend a lot of time, you carefully craft comments that you hope are going to help your students. And then they might well be sitting there looking at this information, a little puzzled, thinking, well, you know, that's very good, Suzanne, thanks very much, but I don't really know what to do next. Whereas going through things this way, they're in a better position to be able to see how they can improve. Now, you could argue the weakness of this particular study is that we didn't actually ask the students to redraft and update their essay, but we did run the study again in a subsequent year, and actually we only ran it focusing on the self-review part without the peer review comments, and between draft and redraft, 70% of the students managed to improve their grades with absolutely no comments from me. So hopefully that, if nothing else, will convince you that it works. And also to add to the picture, there's another recent study who's been published by other authors, and they had a draft-redraft essay situation. And in between, they gave different comparators to different groups of students. So one group had teacher comments, another group had annotated exemplars, and a third group had both. And interestingly, there was no significant difference between the improvements that all 3 groups made. So all groups showed an improvement, but there was no difference. So hopefully you're starting to be convinced, but I realize this is a lot of information so far, so we're going to pause to take some questions before we proceed with the next section of the presentation.
Are there any questions? Yes, okay, I'll run here first. Not fall on the stairs, because that's something I do. I think it's on. Here you go.
Hi, thank you both. That was a really interesting presentation. I just have one question from a teacher perspective. How do you get your students to engage with that task?
Okay. Basically, I think that's part of the advantage of having it in your first year, in first semester, because that's your chance to set the tone, because students are transitioning into university. They don't know what's the normal. So actually, I think this should be the normal way we do things. And if you just set that and build it into your course, don't make it an optional extra that you can do if you fancy it. If it's actually an integral part of your course that students must complete. So I had integrated this particular example as part of my tutorials, then it's just part of what's expected. And I think that's the way, rather than further down the line if you suddenly introduce it then. It's this kind of odd thing that Suzanne does in her class. So that would be my advice.
Then I'm going to squeeze through, give you the mic. Here you go.
Thank you, Suzanne. So the question is, often colleagues will say, oh, if students peer review each other's work, there's a risk that they'll lead each other off down a blind alley or in the wrong direction. So how do you overcome that fear with peers or colleagues?
Suzanne, would you mind repeating a question and then answering it for our recording as well?
Okay, no problem. Okay, so the question is that peers might mislead each other, take each other down blind alleys. So colleagues also might be worried about this potentially being the result. So how do we deal with this? Well, first of all, I think this process is a bit different. And if you're worried actually about what the peers say, take out the peer comments completely, because that's not an integral part of the process. It's the students who are actually making judgments and evaluating where they are themselves. So therefore, that's actually the key part of the process. And they might even find if you include peer comments, they can be conflicting or they'll complain, I put in a lot of work and nobody else did. So actually, I would move away from that part of the process, focus, as I say, on their own work, or there can be other comparators you could bring into the mix. So for example, maybe instead of a peer's work, you might have a resource that's something like a journal article, which is from a reliable source, or a professional article, whatever it is in your discipline.
Yeah.
And I think that would help. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah. I mean, in that study, that was dealt with by the fact that we put in the exemplar. We put in a high-quality example. So in any scenario where you're worried about that, you just need to put a resource in that signals what the better work is, and the students will gravitate towards that. So that's not really an issue anywhere in any of this, yeah?
Who was first? All right.
And this applies to anything. I mean, we'll see later, using ChatGPT or using any of the new AI tools. One of the issues with AI tools is that we don't know the reliability of the information. So the comparison idea fits neatly inside this. Bringing AI into this mechanism, as we'll see later, is not a problem, because we're getting students to make multiple comparisons across different things. And that's how you develop expertise. And that's how you develop critical thinking, when you target the comparisons.
Question.
Hi, first of all, again, thank you for a very insightful presentation. I have a question concerning the time frame, because this was the example of 500 words assignment, seeing that students now also have courses fully online and they already have to read a lot, and if they have to write an assignment and then reread and re-evaluate themselves, how do you plan that into the program which requires more writing assignments?
Okay. Well, I would already have had this written assignment in place. That's not something new that I'd added. So I think that's the thing. It doesn't have to be a written assignment. And the example I'll share in a little while is in a different setting. It's not written. I think it's about seeing what works for your discipline. It's not about inventing new tasks for the students to do. It's looking at what you already have in place and how you can then build the active feedback round about those tasks to help your students really move on and to learn.
In any case, you wouldn't really ask a student, this doesn't work if you say a student's written a thesis and you say, compare your thesis against that other thesis. That's not tractable. This is where instructions become important. You might say, compare the structure of your thesis against the structure of that thesis to target things. So it turns out it's not just about saying to students, and we'll see this as we move to the next example, compare your work against this and tell me what you think. The instructions are critical. You could say, and we didn't do it in this study, you could have said to the students, compare the way these other people have used evidence to support their arguments in that essay and how you've used evidence to support your argument. Now we're on critical thinking, and improve your essay based on that basis. Or compare the way that others have led the student through the writing of that article against the way you've done it, and so on. So a bigger item is not a problem, but you might break it down into something, if you've got bigger writing tasks.
Yeah, exactly. I think that really is nice because you can snippet it to a part where it fits the time frame that you have
Yeah.
within your course. Okay,
Because
I'm going to pass it through again.
the two important things in this are, for the instructor, are selecting the comparators, but that's just one. And then the second one is writing the instructions. And Baz here will tell you that we've been done lots of workshops in Holland on this, and that's where the teachers really need to rethink what they're doing. You need to think, why am I doing this, and what is it? What kind of feedback do I want students to generate?
Yeah, because I think that was the first example where we started. I think when you see the later example coming soon, since we're in a cinema, there's your trailer.
We should just move to the next example after this question.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really just want to draw you out on that question, because the question in my mind about a model that focuses on comparison is how appropriate that is in an inquiry mode. So if it was true that you are always comparing what you know to what is also known.
Yeah.
And I fundamentally believe what you're saying is correct for the development of critical thinking skills, and it's much needed. However, in the case of inquiry-based learning, which is where you're writing a thesis, if that was true, then how would we have come up with quantum physics or something like that? Or any area that is...
the last part of that.
How would we have come up with a totally new frame of reference for explaining things that we don't already know? So what are the limitations of the model in terms of inquiry-based learning?
I mean,
Can I repeat the question real quick, just for the recording?
I'm just going to repeat the question.
So what are the limitations for inquiry-based
for this model with relation to the kind of learning we are engaging in for inquiry-based learning, where the knowns are not known?
Yeah, I think he's talking about how moving beyond what's there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, but that isn't really a problem. What you do is there's a difference between near and far comparators. If you give people further comparators, then they generate more creative stuff. So in entrepreneurship, which we have in our business school, that's what we do. In the entrepreneurship course, we give people things that are quite different, contrasting examples. You see, the weakness in this one, peer review, and everyone likes peer review, is that the exemplars, the things are the same, but actually giving people different things will drag them in a different direction. And that's why you need, I'm not saying peer review is not needed, but we need a mix of strategies. There's not a single way of doing this, but you need the framing to do this. And the framing is comparison. And evaluative judgment, you can't make a judgment of anything without making a comparison. Reflection, you can't reflect on something without a comparator. Problem solving, you can't solve a problem out of the blue. You put your prior solving strategies and you try and place them in the new situation. Everything requires a comparison. And what we need to do is to unpack this. When you read stuff on critical thinking, it's quite difficult to find what the definition is. But it becomes very easy when you have the comparative lens. I think we should Suzanne should move to the next example, because this really moves it to another level.
Right.
We're moving it to a different level.
Do you want to say anything about the slides you had, or do you want me to
I'll just look at this, I think I've said most of this, really. I mean, the starting thing about this is that the really interesting thing about peer review, and a lot of people use peer review, that students learn more from reviewing than from getting comments from peers. And in any peer review scenario, you learn more if you get the students to say, what did you learn from what someone else did, than from getting the comments. And because that involves them in the critical judgment. They're not just receiving a judgment from someone else, they're making it themselves. And it makes them look at things from different perspectives, different ways of doing things. It develops their own internal conception of quality, and they have to rationalize the decisions in writing. The trajectory, I think I've said this, of our new research really was to look at this. We did this study, it was our first study, and then we were working away on this, and we were thinking there's more and more to this. And the trajectory is, one is that we can get students to compare things against. Why should it be similar works? There's no reason why it should be. It can be in different subject, different modality. You can't understand chemistry by narrative alone. You must understand how diagrams and text interrelate. So in lots of subjects, STEM subjects in particular, different modality comparisons are paramount to this. Students, one big issue in the literature is transfer. Students are trying to solve lots of different problems, and then they get same problem with a different cover story, and they can't solve the problem. If you get them to compare problems and abstract the commonalities from them, then they're more able to transfer it. So I think that leads on to Suzanne, who will give you an example of dissimilar entity comparisons.
Okay, so this second example is a computational example. So hopefully this shows you it works in lots of different settings. Therefore, whatever your discipline might be, you can adapt this to work for you. So the starting point, once again, is what are the students going to do? What's the task I'm going to give them? Well, again, this is something that we would always do. So I asked the students to complete a depreciation computation, and then they had to work out all the adjustments to produce their financial statements. So that's the task. Then, before I could pick comparators, I had to think about, well, actually, what is it I'm trying to achieve? And that will help me select the most appropriate comparator. Because remember, different comparators will take you to different places. So the first thing I need is for the students to know, well, how do I do that? How do these calculations work? Can I actually complete them and produce my financial statements? So for the how question, the obvious place to start is what we would traditionally give, is with a worked solution. So the students can quickly and easily compare their work against the solution, and they can see where they have any errors. But that probably isn't very helpful to them in terms of understanding how all that was put together and understanding how they might correct any errors. So I wanted to go a bit further than that, and I thought actually it might be better to give them a comparator in a different format, and the format I chose was an expert video. Now, for lack of another expert, it's me. And it's very low techie tech. It's basically me with my portable visualizer, my pen and a bit of paper, working through the computation, talking about how it all builds up, what I'm thinking about as I'm doing this. And I think that helps the students see behind things, because your worked solution I think of as being very flat. So the students can't really see how things build up. They don't get a feel for the fact that actually you don't just work down from page to page, you're going backwards and forwards between different parts of the information. So in terms of the how questions, that's the two comparators that I give. But I don't want my students to simply be able to churn through examples and reproduce things. I want to push further than that. I want them to understand, well, actually, why do I do this? Why do things work in that way? So in order to try and get to the why question, the comparator this time was a theory-practice comparator. So in this setting for me, the appropriate theory to use is the International Accounting Standards Board's conceptual framework. But that's a really large document, so it's too big to give them the whole thing. So what I did was I selected extracts of concepts, fundamental qualitative characteristics. I gave the students this extract, and I said, right, okay, compare your computation against this extract from the theory, and shortly I'll share with you the instructions I gave to make that one a bit more detailed. But I didn't just want the sort of process comparator with the video or the theory practice comparator with the why question. I wanted to push even further than that again, to more of this evaluative judgment type level and the what-if questions. So in order to achieve this, the comparator I selected this time was again in the same format. It was another computation for exactly the same business, depreciation computation, all the adjustments and the financial statements. All I did was I changed the assumptions that are underlying the depreciation computation. And that makes the students start to understand and realize that actually there's not a right answer here. And if we change the assumptions, that's going to change the picture that's reported in the financial statements. And I'd carefully selected my assumptions so that in their initial example, the client makes a loss, but by changing the assumptions in the new example, suddenly they make a profit. And then I asked them to think about, well, which of these policies are you going to recommend to your client and why? So I asked them to think about this, and we had some sort of written questions they were responding to individually in class, first of all. Then I started to build the layers that David was talking about, where I then moved on to getting them to discuss in peer groups, try and come collectively to a decision of what you're going to recommend to your client. And as they're having these discussions, I then fed another resource into the discussion for comparison purposes. And the resource I selected was this time an extract from the Code of Professional Ethics for Accountants. So you could see the discussion start to shift. So we'd started off with, well, of course we're going to select the policy that gives our client a profit, to actually, but, I hadn't realised that changing the assumptions would change the picture. Why do we produce financial statements? Aren't people going to use them to make important decisions? What's our role as a professional accountant? And who do we have an ethical responsibility to? So our discussions were much more interesting and had pushed well beyond the limits of how do you just churn through these computations. So we were able to achieve so much more and get to a much deeper level of thinking by building things up in this way. So as David had mentioned, the instructions and how we set things up, making the output explicit, is really important. So focusing on that third comparator, the why, the theory practice, here's a little more detail on how we set this one up. So the first three comparators were done outside of class, so they were all completed pre-class, which includes this theory practice comparator. So I got the students to write down responses to the questions here and upload them so I could have a look before the face-to-face session. So I asked them first of all, so remember they've got their concepts that they're comparing with their computational. So which concept do you think is driving this process? And can you explain that? I then asked them to write a note for the client explaining why we include depreciation adjustments in our financial statements. I asked them what they learned about their answer from this process. And finally, I asked them if they had any questions that still remain that they'd like feedback on. The idea being, because all of this is done pre-class, I can have a wee look through, I can pick up the students' questions, and I can begin the face-to-face session by responding to them before we moved to the fourth comparator. So that hopefully gives you a bit more of a flavour about how things worked. In terms of the students' perceptions of this experience, well, actually, they were really positive, because a bit like David talked about before, I'm sure you'd have the same experience as me, where often you'd stand there, you'd say to your students, we'd practice examples, you'd talk about the theory, you'd say, this is why we're doing things this way, but they didn't always seem to explicitly make the connections. And then they'd come back and say, well, I don't know how to deal with this example because it looks different. But actually, doing things in this way, then what students said was learning the theory and the practice work separately is not always clear how the two relate, which is what we see in practice. But this, they found, was very good practice for developing analytical thinking, and it will prove to be more useful when you encounter an issue which does not have a clear procedure to follow. So you can see the students themselves are starting to understand that they've moved beyond the simple, how do I do this, to a deeper level of learning and a deeper level of critical thinking. So I'm going to hand you back to David. So obviously my examples are in my setting. He'll give you a couple of examples in other settings.
Yeah, we wanted to just say that this, we can obviously only give examples in areas we've been working in, but this really applies to any discipline and has many possibilities, and it's difficult to give you the whole range here, but we can, can be looking at theory practice examples, which is the one Suzanne's talked about. Analysis, students produce work through one lens and are asked to generate feedback by analysing it through another lens. Or this, I've talked about the creative thinking, near and far comparators, problem solving, metacognition, or students comparing earlier work with later work to chart their own learning journey. But I've put together some examples in disciplines just to let you look at, to see the possibilities so that you can, I'm not an expert in these disciplines, but let you see just what the possibilities are. I've put them all in the same format so you can see. And this one is very interesting on number 4 because it's not about cognitive things. It's actually about this is actually a study that's happening with colleagues in Utrecht. And it's a study in medicine looking at interpersonal, looking at, doctor and nurse do a discharge situation, and then they compare each other's behaviours in that situation and what they're thinking. And then the student doctor goes around and compares his behaviour or her behaviour against the consultant's behaviour in that situation and generates feedback. And this is much better than the consultant telling them how to get, what they should be doing. So, lots of examples. That's the medicine one. Here's one in human biology, which I always like. I've already mentioned that one in terms of, earlier on, I think. And then, does it work in maths? If it works in maths, it can work anywhere. Okay, so we stop now for questions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and very inspired already. I have a question because when we talk about first-year students, they kind of come into our classes and they forget that they already know a lot of things. So they're like, what is expected of us? What do we need to do? So I was wondering, is there a first step where you just let them do the assignment and then reflect on why they did it the way they did it, to like connect with previous learnings that they have from high school before they compare with other sources.
So a little practice round before they get going for real.
No, it is integrated in. I like to see the starting point. What do they know?
One basic sequence is, and the one that we've been using, initially in research is, do compare, work with peers or something, because doing something yourself is important. I mean, doing something is a feedback generating process and lets students know where they actually are. So getting them to do something would surface where they are by giving them a task, But do you want to say something there?
Yeah, as you say, if there's things they are meant to know already, the way to find out if they know or not is to go through a process like this. They can identify the holes in their knowledge, and then you can have solutions to fill the gaps. And in terms of, I think you were talking about before, summative assessment, giving them a sort of place. Yes, I would do that. I see this actually as something that I build throughout my whole course. I see it as a mechanism that's helping them learn and scaffolding them up towards the summative assessment, rather than just something that's based around the summative assessment itself. Because actually, as the students are going through this process, that's helping them prepare for when they actually have something they're going to get a final grade associated with. So I think you can use it, say, throughout your course, and you can obviously also use it in relation to summative assessment as well. And I would very much advocate do both.
I'd like to add two things there. One is that I've forgotten one of them. one of them is really that, a thing we haven't talked about and we're also researching is comparisons before students do something, because when students compare things beforehand, and we give them two things to compare in the area, and these are more likely to be similar entity type things, and then the students generate understanding of what they're meant to be doing, and then they produce better work. I mean, there's a lot of research on that. Yeah. They produce better work, or not so much doing the comparison, but comparing against rubrics. So they produce better work. But the question is, and they generate feedback during the act of production. They generate better feedback during the act of production because they have a basis on which to generate it. The examples we've looked at beforehand. But the question is, you don't stop there. When they produce something, it doesn't mean their work is perfect. Then you need to think, what's the next comparator I'm going to give them to further improve their work? Now, you might give them the same comparators, but with more targeted instruction. If it was an area that you found, you looked at the students' work and they had difficulty in this area, you might just give them, or you might get the next comparator might be peers, or it might be something completely different. So as Suzanne says, it's not a one-off thing. It's a cyclical thing. Yeah, now I remember the second point. The second point was that don't think that this is a big thing that you have to do, change your whole course. You can do this in a lecture. We usually do it in a lecture. We didn't do it today. We say, we get you to write something down, an application you're going to do. And then we say, now listen to this next bit of the lecture and see if you can improve your application. You're making a comparison against a lecture, which is not what you've produced. It's a lecture that's moving beyond what you've produced. So you can do this anywhere. You don't need to change everything. You can start small and build up. But it just it's a mindset. We've not invented anything new. We've just created a conceptual framing for what exists in all your courses. Students are making comparisons, and you're setting them up. But maybe you're not asking them to consciously make the comparison and write something down about it. And students find that really powerful. They say things like, that made me think more deeply about it. It gave me a record of of my own work on this, my own thinking. And then if you want to assess thinking processes, you've got something to do that with.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's important because I know through the pandemic and everything, we all struggled. We all had to make a lot of changes very quickly. And maybe the thought of reorganising everything again is a bit overwhelming to people. So as David says, you don't have to do that. There are a lot of things you will already be doing in your class. It's just actually identifying these and adding on the bit that makes the process explicit. And there might be places where you can add some extra bits. But just my advice to you is try something small and see what happens. I think you'll be amazed. And then build from there. And if you get your colleagues on board and we all take small steps collectively, that can have a big impact.
It costs you nothing to turn active learning into active feedback. You just give them a comparator. Esther.
David, Susan, thanks for this. Very interesting. I was wondering, are you also researching if students actually improve their original product, their original assignment?
Outputs. You mean what they produce?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of there aren't enough studies, and I'm hoping that we can collaborate on some studies, because we're really at the beginning of this. We now know that students can generate feedback, generate a lot of really powerful feedback, and they feel more empowered by it. There are some studies, like the one back from Lipnevik, and a couple of back from Lipnevik, and the study we've done, but there aren't enough studies. We've got some going on in different places, but we need more research. So anyone who's interested in researching this.
Let's see, who was first?
It's very motivational for students to be doing this, because it really breaks things up and varies the class. My colleague in entrepreneurship just runs his whole professional practice course. Every time they come in for a session, they're making comparisons, different kinds of comparisons. And there's quite a good article in the Times Higher about this, using active feedback in professional practice.
The question in the middle.
Yes. Hello, and thank you again for this very insightful presentation. I'm a bit of a technical buff, and maybe this question is going to be out of the global reflection here, but I have assumed that you were not using FeedbackFruits for this particular endeavor of yours?
No, we didn't have any connections at that point, but we're obviously very interested. Because actually what I've found quite often is when I'm trying to set these things up, a lot of systems, say the peer review one, for example, they're set up to deal with students giving each other comments. And it took a lot of creative thinking to try and work around the systems because they didn't help me. Whereas actually if we had people who could help design the systems, that would be much, much better.
Okay. So
We really want FeedbackFruits to kind of come on board and help us develop something that would actually make this work even better.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so shall I assume that you guys are working on a pen and paper for this this whole process of self-evaluation and all that?
No, not necessarily, no. I use the resources we have available at the University of Glasgow. So, for example, if the students are doing work, it's Moodle is the system we have. So I use Moodle. There's a system called Aropa I use if it's a peer review setting. And I've gone all blank on anything else I use, but it's just the systems the university has available for students that have to work round, and I get them to upload their work. Sometimes if it's in class setting like this, I do go old school and I have a handout worksheet and I fill that in because I sometimes find if they're going to actually, you can see what they're doing, if they're going to turn to people and talk, they can do it on their laptops if they want, but I know then they're not watching Netflix or something. So I think both situations work. It depends on the setting that you're working within.
Okay, I think when I saw your slide with all the self-evaluation and all that, I think that's a tremendous thing to take as an endeavor. With FeedbackFruits, it would be really great, and I think it could save you time and effort. So. I'm pretty sure.
No, I'm 100% sure it would save me time and effort and would be fantastic.
Thank you, Adrian. I think there was a question right here.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. I found it super interesting. I was just wondering if you've ever done any research on the spillover effects of your comparison intervention on students' performance in other assignments that don't have this comparison feature. So in other words, would a student who did this activity for 1 or 2 assignments maybe apply the feedback skills that they trained in another assignment? Because if we're trying to get students to be more autonomous or self-regulated, we don't necessarily want them to be dependent on having teachers adopt this feature for all assignments, but I imagine that doing it a couple of times would give students the tools or a framework that they would need to apply it to different areas of their learning.
Yeah.
Yes, this is very true and very much where we're trying to move things to. So yes, and it's something I say to my students, you know, look, you don't need to rely on what Suzanne says. You can set yourself free and you can just get on with it. And I have other colleagues who are sort of moving this way too. And ultimately that's where, oh, you popped back up there. I thought you were putting up your slide. Ultimately that's where we want to get students to. And we foresee that as students get more into this way of doing things, that they should actually be able to be the ones in the driving seat, selecting the comparators, doing this without us having to set it up or doing it for each other.
I think that's a very good question. I mean, that's really at the heart of all of this, because we say we want to move away from teacher comments, and then we teachers are selecting all the comparators and everything. It actually doesn't really work that way, because the student, like this student, immediately saw, I said to this class of students, how many people have done this somewhere else now that you've had this experience? And you know, they said, oh yeah, I did this with the abstract. I used your protocol and I compared the abstracts, and then I did a better abstract. So they do get into this. And in fact, actually, in anticipation of your question, I wasn't going to show this slide, but I made a last slide. You know, I've got other slides, but you know, this one here, you know, because this is, Suzanne usually says this at a talk. She says, if students can do this in the first semester of the first year, what will they be able to do by the 4th year? And that's really, you know, we haven't researched. I mean, basically, you know, we're just dying for people to do research on this, but there isn't enough of us doing it, you know. Yeah. But it really has, when I started this research, I thought it was just too simple. And then every study, every students were so enthusiastic, the results were so positive. You know, that it was just really exciting, but there's the feedback literature in general is not pulling in this direction, because it's very much locked into the idea that feedback's a dialogue. And this thing about And of course, I've moved it, even since the first papers I wrote, I've moved away from, it's about, the big thing is it's not about similar entity comparisons. You know, it can be anything. Anything can be a comparator if it has educational value. And then the second thing is you do need to be good at writing instructions. You need to know what you're trying to get, you know, initially. You know, you can have instructions don't need to be tightly defined. They could be open-ended, going by your point, if you just want the students to see what they get out of it. But if you want to target something, you need to be able to know how to do that.
This is a very eager row, so I have one more question.
Sorry. Yes, thank you. I'm totally convinced that comparison is an effective way of generating feedback. But my question is, and maybe it relates also to this, how do people get beyond? Because if I look at what students do, I'm not sure the comparison is the only way in which they generate feedback. So another way might be, but maybe you also see this as comparison, I don't know. But another way might be they try something and they see what happens. And so this is, for example...
They try something and they compare what happens.
But let me give you an example. And then,
you know?
So maybe that's the way to think about it. But so I have this story, I don't know if it's true, but of a person who wanted to... Their goal was to learn how to engage people more and how to in their public speaking. And so their exercise was to stand next to the metro exit and just talk to random people and try different things and see how long people would talk to them.
But they're
Is
trying,
that comparison?
They're trying and compare them. The good example I have in this, my colleague in entrepreneurship, you know, the students work and they work as a consultant to a client in a business. And if that first meeting with the client doesn't work, you know, if it fails, then the whole process, you know, unravels, and the university gets a bad reputation because we send students to talk to the client and they don't really ask the right questions and they're not very good at it. So what he does is he gives them, you know, gets them to make a plan for their meeting with the client, and then he gets them to compare against an article about how to establish rapport with clients. But then he shows them a video of a doctor interviewing a patient with a heart condition, you know, presenting with a heart condition, and he gets them to compare their plan against this thing that's quite different from, you know, well, it's similar to the client relationship, and then he asks some questions about how would you establish empathy in this situation based on that. How would you apply that to your... Now, this is the paper that's in the Times Higher campus edition thing that you can find online. But basically, he got really good results with that. And all his students did better with the clients. And all their projects were much better after he went through this procedure. So it really can be applied anywhere. But I think it's quite hard to... Once you lock into this thing about comparison, you see, I think that's what's really not been realized by this, because it's the invisible part of all our cognition. It's just there. We're doing it everyone is doing it all the time, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in your example, they'll have to compare all their experiences with all the different people, extract from that what worked, what didn't, why. So there is a comparison even just in that without bringing in anything separate. Because the thing is that person is just naturally doing it. I mean, it's happening naturally all the time anyway. It's just that if, as educators, we can turn it into a powerful pedagogical tool, and there's only one important principle, and that is to make it explicit, you know, to make the process explicit and make the output explicit. I wanted to just say something about the emergence of ChatGPT, because I think that this model that we're talking about is very relevant to the emergence of generative AI tools. So I'm using ChatGPT as an example. And the first thing is that, you know, one of the big issues, you know, taking the three main issues about ChatGPT in the literature, and I've been reading a lot of that literature, is the information might be unreliable in some way. We don't know what the sources are. How are we going to get students to use AI and deal with that? Well, for the gentleman up there, they need to make comparisons against something. You know, how are they going to judge the reliability of the information without making comparisons? So, you know, we need to create scenarios where they're comparing AI outputs against something else. You know, I'll show you this diagrammatically in a moment. The second issue is academic integrity. Who is doing the work, the student or the machine? You know, we're a summative assessment, real problem in all of this. The solution to summative assessment, make the processes explicit.
and assess those processes. If we get students to be creating explicating their own inner feedback all the time, we're making all of our courses focus on process, and from that, we can sample from that. So maybe we have to do some adjustments that when students can do anything with ChatGPT out of class, when they get in class, then we can control the environment a bit and get them to make some kinds of comparisons. And then we can sample some of those in-class activities for our summative assessments, solve that problem. Then the third issue is the loss of the human dimension, in learning. And our argument is that there's not one source of information. We want to integrate dialogical and resource comparisons. We want to retain the human. And in all of our work, we get students to compare against resources, observations, etc. But we always get them to have peer discussions and things like that. So we bring that in to the whole process. And we amplify all of the learning by contextualizing things in the human, in the authentic. And it looks like this, as a kind of summary of this, is that this is self-regulation. Students do something, do some work, they compare it against their goals. I mean, they're not behaving randomly. They have some goals, even if they're mistaken, and they generate some feedback out of it. But that isn't the only source of feedback for the students. They're comparing against external resources of different kinds. Discussions with people, comments from people, information from resources and observations. And now they have ChatGPT. They can use that as well and generate and make. But the important thing is that they need to make comparisons across all three sources of information. But then, to really make this valuable, it needs to be made explicit. We need to have an explicit output from the inner feedback and from these comparisons, because that gives us information about process learning that we can use for our summative assessments. So that's the kind of main thinking in terms of ChatGPT. We'll have the questions. I'll just do this, and then we can finish on questions. Basically, this model acknowledges students as the architects of all of their own feedback productions in a way that nothing else does. It provides, I say, I didn't invent anything new here. It just provides a conceptual model for what's happening naturally. And that's what the really beauty of it. It's just happening everywhere. It's not difficult for us to do it, the making of feedback comparisons. It brings into play multiple sources of information beyond comments, exemplars, and different comparators lead to different feedback. That in itself would be a reason. Why would we just keep giving students comments, one source and one kind of information? Different teachers' comments would result in different types of feedback outputs from the students anyway. Why don't we vary it, in some way? Feedback can serve many different purposes. It can target all kinds of things. You just need the thinking and the ingenuity to think how to do that. It's a way of addressing the issue of academic feedback workload and of addressing the tension between feedback as telling and wanting students to be self-regulated learners. It brings together informal, because it's a natural process, and formal learning in mutually productive ways, and aligns with new tools like ChatGPT. And the key to all is that students need to make mindful comparisons with explicit outputs. So that's the... And even now, we haven't gone into all the possibilities, because on one level, it's incredibly simple. On another level, there's such depth and possibility behind this that we keep discovering something new. In my institution, the real problem was that I brought out the ideas, and then people thought they really knew what I was talking about. And then a year later, I'd kind of shifted the ground, and they thought, well, won't bother going and hearing what he says, because we've heard it. But it's not, every day we're discovering new things in this area.
I have a question on this side first.
Okay. And there's one that side.
Well, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. I'm definitely very much convinced. I've been doing stuff like this in the past as well. But the question in my mind may be a bit different. I can hear the teachers already in my institution thinking this is a lot of work and quite difficult, will take a lot of their time. So how would you suggest we go about seducing them into utilizing this and going more into this direction?
Okay. Well, if I could answer that one, please. So yes, I agree that any change you make, it's unrealistic to say there will be zero work involved. But I would say there's a small upfront investment and you actually get a much longer term benefit. Because actually I was very pleasantly surprised in the second computational example I shared with you, where I gave the students the video comparator for how to do the computation as well as the worked solution. And one of the questions I'd asked them at each stage was what questions did they have for me? And there was quite a lot of questions after the first, just with your worked solution. But by the time they'd compared their thinking with mine in the video, almost every student wrote, I don't have any more questions for you. So there was a small upfront cost in making the video, but I can use that again. There was a wee bit of time in thinking of the idea, but then I've got it. I can use that again. And in the longer term, as I say, I was sort of sitting there thinking, why is nobody asking me anything? What's gone wrong? So actually the students start to learn more on their own and break the link. So you do get the longer term benefits of they're actually doing it and you're just monitoring and stepping in when you're needed. But realistically, there's a little upfront effort. Also, the other big benefit for them is this not much better way to set things up than sit and mark like 500 essays or 500 calculations. Actually, if the students have done all this and you've got less marking, maybe that's a better way to sell it to them. Not that we never mark anything or never comment, but I find, especially when they've just come in first year, the students are very much in the frame of mind. They should just be like what Suzanne says goes, and what they really want is me just to comment on every single thing that they do. I can't, and I don't think it's best for them. So actually this reduces that workload for me as well. It's not why I do it, it's not the driving factor, but it might be a helpful selling factor to your colleagues. Yes, twofold, could potentially reduce the commenting that you have to do or make it more targeted. It will help your students learn and become more independent, so you'll have less questions as you go through.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. I know that there's one on this side and then the gentleman over here.
Hi, thank you very much. Just a short question. How do you grade the final outcomes? Is that based on the final output or or on the reflection of the inner feedback?
Okay. This is a very good question. How do you grade the final outcomes? Is it on the output or is it on the inner feedback? Which is actually a really good question and where I'm currently moving to next. Because the examples I shared with you were based on formative rather than summative assessment, so I wasn't actually grading those particular ones. And I think, to be honest, with the evolution of AI and ChatGPT, we need to move much more away from just thinking about output and thinking about process. And that's where I think the inner feedback is going to build in. So my plan that's not fully formulated for next year's course is to link the two together, so there'll be some credit for output, but some credit for getting to that critical thinking that's going on behind the scenes. And that's going to come through from the inner feedback outputs that they're generating.
We have one example of that, actually, a published example, using 2-stage exams, where the students do some work individually and then they do the same work again in groups. But we introduced a comparative activities between each of them. And so, you could call them reflective comparisons. And we ran a 2-stage exam, a real exam in economics, and the students were graded on the individual work, the group work, and their comparative reflections. And we thought it would be a real problem, but the students really liked it. So that's a good starting point. We didn't use extra resources. I think when we go down that path again, we'll be using other comparators within it as part of the process. But I think the 2-stage exam could be a good model for doing some of this in a summative way. But as Suzanne, and then there's another colleague actually, in Jenny Rose in Manchester Alliance, who is looking at some way of grading the feedback outputs. There's two possibilities. I think she's looking at it through Perry's intellectual development framework, but I think you could also look at it through the solo taxonomy of Big's solo taxonomy, which has a taxonomy of different levels of thinking. But we're just at the beginning of that. If you want to do some research, that would be good.
And that brings us to the final question.
Hi, thank you both. I've got two ideas, and they're kind of mushing around in my head, and they're not entirely clear, so apologies in advance.
Can you put the microphone slightly closer?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Think about your previous comments about the process rather than the product, and I think that's going to be especially important for ChatGPT. I was thinking about this comparative approach in terms of when it could be most effective, or is it effective along the journey from having that idea, the reading, the conceptualization, and then the actual written expression of that idea, and getting feedback on that written expression. And thinking laying ChatGPT on top of that, I think we're going to be moving into a world where it's co-created, co-generated, co-comparative, and what that co-bit is going to bring when you're having that in real time. As you are writing, a tool is writing with you, comparing it with you and generating with you, and what that will have with this model. Like I say, it will layer on, but I'd be really fascinated to think what you think that might bring.
Yeah.
Can you answer
you're
that?
bringing up a slide.
I didn't add the last bit of that diagram, by the way.
Yeah.
Learner self-regulation and learner co-regulation. So we are, what's the key aspect of that?
I think there's multiple aspects to what you're asking. One of them in terms of when you use this, to me the answer is always, because I now see it as an integral learning mechanism throughout my course. So gradually, I couldn't do it all at once, but gradually over time, I've shifted to a position where, like of the computational example I shared with you, that's just going on in my class as standard now. And I've sort of worked that right the way through my course so that the students are just kind of doing it without even thinking. So I therefore think you're doing it every day, you're doing it to help all the different stages, and also when you get to the summative assessment as well, I think you can be using it there, because even when the students have given something to you that you're going to provide comments on, maybe they'd be in a better place to receive those comments if while you're marking, they're doing something else as well and coming to their own conclusions, which they then compare with yours. So using it always would be my response to that, which I think is one part of the question. The other part, I think, was about using all the multiple resources. We've got things like AI that can be writing alongside you. And these are obviously things we're all getting to grips with, and I'm guessing this is why you brought up this slide.
Yeah, I think that thing is because I can't really see, given I've played a lot with ChatGPT, for example, and I can't see how we can. We need to focus on the process, and I think we need to divide in-class activities where we can say. You've got some kind of, I mean, I'm not sure how you do this specifically online though, but synchronous activities, but where you've got some kind of control over what students are using, so that you're surfacing, their feedback generation in situations where, where the machine isn't creating the work. Outside of class, you just have to accept that they're going to use it, whatever you do. But I think that maybe part of the solution to this problem is sampling in-class activities, where you're sampling process, and also having students keep some kind of portfolio of their, of their process activities, which they can use productively because they can compare later thinking against earlier thinking. So it could also be a comparison resource for charting for them their own learning journey. But we are tackling this. I mean, I'm on that committee in our university looking at that. So we are thinking about it.
Any closing notes from both of you?
I don't know. It was a very great pleasure to be here and to chat to this.
Indeed. Yes, thank you for having us, I think.
Amazing. Well, could I?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. Thank you so much, David and Suzanne.
I mean, I can't even believe that I need to talk right now. I was too engrossed in listening. Thank you. I think the main takeaway really for this is, as you said, it's not necessarily anything new, right? It's been here all along.
Yeah.
But you can utilize it, you can use it, and it can have such a marginally high benefit if we really learn how to integrate these processes and methods into our teaching.
It's a mindset change. You just need to switch your mind. See, now I can't look at anything without seeing comparison in it. So it's just a mindset. Some people switch the mindset quickly, and then other people seem to take more time to do it.
Yeah, I have to be fair and say, don't be put off, because when I was trying to think about the details, it did take me a little while to sort of come up, particularly with the second example. I had an inspirational morning. But I think your starting point is just think about what it is you want to do. And if you're not clear on that, then you'll struggle to figure out what even to pick as a comparator. So think about what you want to do, and then it will start to unfold from there.